call it a perfect storm, but it is a combination of causes that is creating an unsustainable situation.
Just one day after the LNU Lightning Complex fires tore through Vacaville, we're getting a good look at the devastation and destruction left behind.
We were asleep. And they came down the street with the lights on and going door to door to tell everybody they have to evacuate. It was 4:30 in the morning. My daughter woke me up and she says, we're being told to evacuate.
In the COVID-19, the Red Cross has been preparing for the last 4 months. All food must be sealed at the kitchen site, and then we hand them fixed packages of food and they eat them at their canteen in their cots. One of the other big differences that we have is we've doubled and tripled the size of the distance between cots, which means the capacity of our shelters reduced by almost 50%, leading us to have to open twice as many shelters to accommodate the same number of people as in previous disasters.
Now at 11, we have breaking news. The Bay Area burning as hundreds of wildfires rage. CAL FIRE warns all of us, be prepared to leave at a moment's notice. And tonight, we are live on the front lines with the news.
The fires in California have been nothing short of devastating. We can't just blame it on climate change. The issue goes much deeper than that. The fact is that over 95% of fires ignited by humans hurt humans. Me and others in Northern California got to see our forests, grasslands turned to nothing. It's August 17th, 2020. School has just begun, but it's online. I haven't seen my friends in person since March 13th, the day they said school would be out for only 2 weeks. On that day, I was in the Sonic across the street from high school. Since it was Friday and school got out early on Fridays, many other students did the same. I was sitting with some of my friends eating a meal when other students burst into the Sonic and announced that school was canceled for 2 weeks. What's funny is that everyone cheered and was happy about this. How little we knew. Now it had been about 7 months since then, and I was getting on my computer again to go to virtual school. But something was off about this morning. I woke up feeling rested, but it was still pitch black outside. I usually woke up after the sun rose, not before it.
It's so dark. The camera's making it a little more extreme than it is, but it's super duper dark, and it's all because of the smoke. You can see a little bit of the haze, but besides that, it's almost pitch black.
I thought it was just early in the morning still, until I checked the time. It was about 5:58 a.m. It was very odd because the sun was usually up by 7 a.m. The smell of smoke rushes through my nostrils. My body alerts me of a soreness in my throat that I didn't have the day prior. I was so disoriented. I thought it had just rained last night. Why was there a fire? How could there be a fire? Another one? I drew the curtains and opened the blinds of my bedroom window, which had a clear view of the mountains in the distance. It was dark, but the one thing that I could see was the silhouette of the mountains against a deep red glow that reflected against the black sky. This is what I imagined hell looked like. I got up and I rushed downstairs to see if anyone was awake. I saw both of my parents in the kitchen, staring through the windows and looking into the sky just like I just was, trying to see any sign of the sun. My parents turned on the local news, but oddly enough, there was absolutely zero coverage on what we were seeing outside. That means that this was very recent. This had just started. I had never, ever seen this intense of a fire in my life, let alone this fast growing of a fire. We decided to go out into the front yard to get a better understanding of our situation, but we were met with more confusion. The streetlights were still on. Nobody else is around since it's COVID, so it looks like a ghost town. We know this must be a fire, but there's no fire we've experienced that had the ability to completely block out the sun. I'm reminded of the Paradise Fire years before, when me and my dad were driving up with a trailer full of water bottles to help those who were losing their homes. Smoke always reminds me, it always lets you know that there's a fire nearby. No cabin air filter or recirculation system, HVAC system, whatever, will be able to completely get rid of the smell. There will always be a small scent of it. It sticks to everything, makes your clothes, your hair smell like smoke. We drove up to a parking lot in town close to the Paradise Fires. It was acting as a drop-off location for donated supplies. My cousins, who lived in Chico, about 10 miles from Paradise, met us at this location, since they were also doing what they could to help out our fellow Northern Californians. But they were also facing the possibility of having to evacuate their home if the fires didn't stop. Each fire has a story on how it started. Sometimes they start because of baby showers. The one next to my town started from lightning strikes, and this one started because of poorly maintained electricity poles by the state electricity company. When me and my cousin met, I distinctly remember the orange tint that was over everything because of the smoke in the air. From this point on, whenever I see a haze in the distance, a tinge in the light, or a faint smell of a campfire, I am taken back to these moments. Me and my parents go back inside and check the news, who have just now started to cover the fire when we can already clearly see that something bad's happening. We learn how it started. The rain the night before brought lightning, which isn't common in our area, and it set fire to the brush in multiple areas. So this wasn't one big fire, it was multiple fires, all in the same area. They were mostly located around Lake Berryessa. This is located about 25 minutes from where I lived at the time. We had gotten a boat just a few years prior to this, but it was by far our favorite family activity, to go out onto the water and just bask in the sun and chill for just a few hours. We would always launch at Markley Cove, since it's the first boat launch along the road to the lake. We would always eat lunch at a small island that we named Schuetz Family Island. Me and my siblings would go and explore the island as if we were adventurers. I loved going to that lake, and me and my family made so many fun memories there, and I'll never forget it. When we returned after the fires had ceased to see the damage, weeks later, we couldn't even recognize the landscape. When we returned to Lake Berryessa, there was no vegetation. The earth was bald. The landscape was transformed from a beautiful, lush landscape with green oak trees and golden grass to nothing but dirt and ash. When we got to Markley Cove, we found it had burned to the ground, leaving only the concrete foundation of the office and parking lots, as if nothing had ever been there. They announced that the cove wouldn't be opening for the foreseeable future. My dad decided to sell the boat after we found this out. While the fire was still going on, my friends were getting evacuated. One by one, each of my friends told me that they were forced to leave their homes since the fire had already entered the city lines. At one point, we had a friend of ours stay in our home since they had nowhere else to go. They were an older couple, and the husband was a previous mayor of Vacaville. He always loved talking about math and engineering with me. He was a fun guy to be around. My mom was an at-home care provider for this couple before COVID, so I got to see them periodically with my mom. Their home was cozy and full of interesting trinkets and devices that they had collected over the years. The husband had an amazing coin collection upstairs, which I loved sorting through every time I visit. Thankfully, the fire didn't get to their house, but it was within yards from it. Thinking back on this, it's interesting how nobody, not even the policymakers, are immune to the fires. Our schools were also evacuated, so the school district decided to cancel classes for a week, even though we were only about 2 weeks into online COVID school. More and more of my friends from even the nearby cities, Davis and Fairfield, were getting evacuated. It felt like some awful dream where everything during the already worst year of my life was getting destroyed. The fire line kept getting closer and closer to our house as the fire displayed no signs of stopping. The fire started burning homes, and the firefighters couldn't do anything because the winds were too high. The public library and community college were both turned into evacuation centers, but these centers had to deal with strict COVID regulations while still helping those who were injured or displaced. It was the first time I had seen firsthand the destruction of lives with almost no hope in sight. Then the winds finally calmed, and the firefighters were able to contain the fire. although damage had already been done. Only houses mainly along the outskirts of the city were destroyed. Much of the city remained fine, but when it was over, we learned about the impact it had on our community. My school's principal's house was completely burned to the ground, and a GoFundMe was started for her. My sister's friend's house has been burnt, and their family had to live in a trailer, and they eventually had to move because it was too expensive to buy a new home. Lives were ruined from this disaster, and landscapes were decimated.
So I am a professor in the Department of Environment and Society, and I've been at Utah State University since 1992. And I have a doctorate in forestry, but I work on how people affect nature and nature affects people, and especially working in landscapes that are managed for natural resources, for grazing or for timber, things like that. When I was a younger person, in my late 20s, early 30s, I was a firefighter. I was also a newspaper reporter at the time, and I was writing about natural resource issues. But I was also a volunteer firefighter in northwestern Montana. So I have fought fires, not, mostly grass, but not huge forest fires. And then a lot, my personal experience is more, knowing that it's important. I am in charge of something called the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange. And what we do, we're funded by the federal government, and what we do is we take the latest fire science and try and translate it and make it relevant to land managers in our region. So that covers the northeastern California, eastern Oregon, southern Idaho, all of Nevada, the western half of Utah. So that's, studied fire. I've also done a lot of work trying to understand how people respond to efforts to reduce fire hazard. So, there are tools that land managers can use to reduce the risk of fire, but some of them people aren't that comfortable with. They may think they're unattractive, they may think that they pose risks, they may just prefer what they believe to be a natural landscape. And so, one of the things that fire managers and land managers need to understand is, how does the public view what we're doing?
That is a big part of it. These fires that burned down my high school principal's house, they're what we've created them to be. Humans are very good at preventing wildfires, actually. I feel that the best way to summarize how we've gotten to this point is with a graph. I know that there's a lot here, so let's unpack. Firstly, we can see that after Smokey was introduced in the early 1900s, there's a dramatic decrease in burned area, aka a decrease in forest fires. Simultaneously, we can see a huge increase in water reservoir usage, along with a huge boom in population. For a while, it felt like we could actually stop forest fires from happening at all. And then, in the late 80s, things began to change. We started to run out of space in the most populated areas, so people began to move into what's considered to be the wildland-urban interface. This is where wildland and the urban population meet. So if you've ever seen houses on the edges or within a forest, that could be considered wildland-urban interface. Tens of millions began to swarm into these areas. And due to these areas being much more susceptible to fires, federal fire suppression costs have increased dramatically. We're going to ignore the purple curve because it goes beyond the scope of this video. This means that for a little while, there was no fires occurring. Vegetation would die, but it would never be recycled like it's naturally meant to be. We've also been trying to urbanize areas that are simply not meant to be urbanized, building more and more houses in the wilderness, which is most susceptible to fires. Finally, we've been collecting more and more water for ourselves, which means less and less water for the surrounding landscape. Something this graph can't represent, however, is the ongoing drought in the West. I remember when they made it cost money to get water from a restaurant because the drought was so awful that they needed to incentivize people to drink less water. This causes an area and a time where summers can be so hot and dry that it would just kill more vegetation and thoroughly dry it out. We need to remove this idea that Smokey the Bear has taught us, which is that all fire is bad, because it's not. I was told, kind of how it was described to me, is that Smokey the Bear is kind of the start of how we in the West think of fire as a bad thing.
It precedes Smokey the Bear, but Smokey the Bear was an incredibly successful marketing campaign. And so, the purpose of the whole Smokey the Bear campaign after the Second World War was only you can prevent forest fire. So the assumption already was that forest fires are bad. Certainly after there was a huge fire in 1910 that burned across the Idaho Panhandle and into a lot of northwestern Montana. And that was a very bad fire year. But after 1910, that's when the Forest Service, which is a brand new agency, decided we're going to try and put every fire out by 10 o'clock in the morning if we hear about it at night. And so, they started putting the fire towers and that sort of thing. So the agencies had already, had decided that fire was bad. Now we add this campaign that tells people to be careful, but it reinforces this idea that fire is bad, that fire will harm the forest. There are certainly short-term harms that come from that, but there are forest ecosystems that depend on wildfire in order to be able to be sustained, either because the cones won't germinate, produce seeds, or simply because they're used to frequent, low-intensity, frequent fires that burn the understory, burn the fuels underneath. The trees have bark that allows them to be able to withstand that, and the sequoias, the giant sequoias and the redwoods are among those kinds of forests that have evolved to be able to withstand low-intensity wildfire, but are not as able to withstand the high-intensity wildfires we've created. In order for the seeds to be released from a tightly packed cone, the cone opens under heat.
Oh, so it's kind of like popcorn.
It's kind of like popcorn, yeah. Yeah, except, imagine a bunch of popcorn pieces inside a cone.
It's essential to realize that wildfires for an ecosystem is like vitamins for humans. It's very healthy to have them in moderation, but if you have too many, it can be detrimental.
We have seen an increase in the size, frequency, and the intensity of wildfires in most of the western United States over especially the last 30 years. And this is partly due to prolonged drought, which is associated with climate change. We have, warmer temperatures and drier air, which means that essentially the flash point, the likelihood that a spark will become a fire, has increased. So that's part of it, so the likelihood of fires happening. But at the same time, we also have, for 100 years now, we have been suppressing wildfires that would have burned naturally because we live in these areas now, and we want to protect timber that we think, that we want to be able to turn into wood products. So there's different kinds of things going on, and we have this challenge of the traditional way of dealing with it has been to simply try and put out every fire we can. And as a result, we've had this very large buildup of fuels. In rangelands instead of in forests, we have a similar situation. So not so much that the fuels have built up because of fire suppression, because one, there's been a large increase in invasive non-native grasses from Central Asia, particularly cheatgrass, that carries a fire much more than the grasses that would have found out in the West Desert or in the northeastern corner of California. So that's part of it. We also have fewer people running livestock, and cattle eat grass. And so with more people moving in, and I think about in California, for example, we have more and more people moving into the Sierra foothills. And many of them have no interest in raising livestock. They may believe that cattle don't belong on the land, or they may simply have other things to do. They're retired, they telecommute to Sacramento or San Francisco or Bombay for that matter. And so for lots of reasons, they're allowing the land to build up more fuel. And then when we do have a fire and a lightning strike, or a lot of the fires are human caused, not necessarily carelessness, but just things that, heavy equipment can cause sparks. ATV use can send up sparks. People target shooting, if the bullet hits a rock, you can shoot up a spark. All of those different things can create more fire. And because of climate, they're more likely to turn into a fire, and because of the fuel, they're more likely to become a big and intense fire. And so in California, drought has been a particular problem there, and so that's part of it. I mean, it's also been a problem in the Southwest, but in California, among other things, some of the species of plants are more likely the oaks are really good at bursting into flames because they actually have volatile oils in the leaves. And so, Oak trees may be especially susceptible to wildfire when they do occur. And then the other thing is that California has just become so populous that people are everywhere. And so that increases the likelihood that there will be a fire. It increases the number of power lines that PG&E or the Southern California agency, I can't remember what they're called, the power companies have to maintain. If they blow down in a high wind, then you might have challenges there. So there's just, I don't want to call it a perfect storm, but it is a combination of causes that is creating an unsustainable situation.
In my ecology class, I've been taught about succession. During the middle of succession, when diversity is the highest, that is exactly where plant growth is the highest. This means that without succession, forests and ecosystems aren't as healthy as they can be.
Ideally, what you have is, I like the term, you use this term mosaic again, but ideally you have a bunch of patches of landscape that are at different stages of succession. Perhaps there's been a fire or there's been an outbreak of bark beetles or something, and so trees die and then they fall over, and then you get new trees coming back. There are different species of plants and animals that are adapted to different stages of succession. A really healthy landscape, I use the term landscape to just mean a large expanse of land. But ideally what you've got across this expanse is you've got some areas that are early in successional stages, you've got some that are in mid stages and some that are in late stages. In order to be able to sustain the biological diversity that's healthiest, you need to have all of those different stages. And so fire is an important part of that whole process, because fire is one of the ways that the land goes back to what we call an earlier state, a grassland or a wildflower meadow, things like that. Some wildflower meadows are permanent and a lot of them are not. A lot of them will become shrubland or they'll become forest eventually. And that whole process of renewal is really critical, and it's where you get the best growth. A healthy landscape has got all of these different kinds of successional stages. And so that's why fire is a critical part of the ecosystem, because it's the way that nature maintains those successional stages, at least in our environment.
Dr. Gillis is a retired professor from UC Berkeley and was the dean of the College of Natural Resources at UC Berkeley. He currently serves as chair of the California Board of Forestry and Fire Protection, the department responsible for passing policies that CAL FIRE follows to protect against future wildfires. He cited in one of his research papers that state policies are created for pre-fire measures, but ultimately not carried out due to the fast-paced structure of CAL FIRE's work environment. Now, clearly this paper is outdated, and a lot has happened since then. But something else that's also clear is that there hasn't been enough change. So please, Joe Tyler, Director and Fire Chief at CAL FIRE, I urge you to please take better pre-fire measures with CAL FIRE. We've gotten this idea that wildfires, all fires for that matter, are detrimental, but that's simply not true. And we need to break that stigma, and we need to realize that in order to grow from these travesties, we need to allow nature to go through its natural processes.
Looking forward, how do you see the situation evolving in our response?
Thinking about California, a bunch of graduate students and I and a couple of other professors did a survey in California a couple of years ago. We wanted to know whether experiencing the 2020 wildfires, whether experiencing those changed people's ideas about what kinds of practices should be used. Was there, for example, a change in support for public service power shutoffs, where when conditions are really bad, we're just going to turn off the power so that they won't, ignite fire? How do people feel about regulations? And unfortunately, people were really most interested in voluntary kinds of things. They wanted education or incentives. Give me some money to be able to reduce the fuel hazard around my house. And they thought that the Forest Service should be doing, and agencies should be doing more for fuels reduction. They didn't necessarily want to see regulations to make houses more flame resistant, because that would cost them money.
Yeah.
They didn't necessarily want to see insurance rates change, even though in many parts of California now you can't even get insurance, for your home because it's so flammable. And so I think we're partway there, but we're not all the way where we need to be to really understand what the problem is and what we need to do about it. And then the other half is just, we have 100 years of what turned out to be misguided, well-meaning but misguided fire policy. And we haven't, it's gonna take a while. It just is, we don't have the funds, the resources to be able to do everything that needs to be done very quickly. We don't have people to do the work. We don't have the money to pay them. We don't have the, it's gonna take a while. This year we got a respite, with all the rain that happened last winter and snow across the entire West. We've had a pretty mild fire season in Utah especially, but we can't count on that. We got a breather, but we need to be gearing up for the next time,